It's my distinct pleasure. I'm the Dean of the Barenboim-Said Academy and a professor of musicology here in Montana. And it is my distinct pleasure to invite Michael Baers for this second lecture. I first learned of Michael through our colleague Sonia Higazi, who told me of this wonderful figure who is doing all sorts of work in Western Sahara and Palestine. And I thought to myself, well, this is someone I need to get to know. And sure enough, he is someone that I am getting to know, and his work I'm starting to enjoy more and more, and I'm very much looking forward to tonight's lecture. Michael received his PhD from the Academie der Bildenden Kunst here in 2014 from its dedicated artistic research department, and he's had a lot of his work exhibited internationally at the Museum für Angewandte Kunst in Frankfurt am Main, the Haus der Kulturen der Welt, and at the Van Abbe Museum. And since 2010, for about 10 years, he's focused on the cultural outcomes of conflict irresolution in the Middle East and North Africa. Since 2013, he conducted a research on a unique photographic project that emerged between the war between the people of Western Sahara and Morocco, Sahara Occidentale con poche immagini. And this sort of moved into lateral research, into media theory and visual studies, as well as the history of Northern Africa. Before that, he researched cultural politics in Israel and Palestine, and in 2014, publishing online with the Haus der Kulturen der Welt, a lengthy graphic work about his 2011 project, Picasso and Palestine, an oral history of Picasso and Palestine. He's also published comics and texts on contemporary art and artistic research, cultural politics, and urbanism, contributing to a variety of publication projects and internationally recognized journals, such as A Prior, the eFlux Journal, the Vector Critical Research in Context. So without further ado, let's give Michael a warm round of applause. Thank you.
Thanks. So I'd like to thank Mina for giving me the opportunity to speak to you, and to Amel for helping to organize, and also thanks to Sonia for putting my name forward. Much appreciated. So I guess the introductory remarks that I would make in my text have been made a little bit redundant by the introduction, but please bear with me. So I will just get right to it. Over the last 9 years, I've worked on 2 different long-term research projects. One concerns the Picasso and Palestine exhibition of 2011, which resulted in a long article in the eFlux Journal and an even longer graphic novel, Come Oral History. A second, more recent research deals with the photographic legacy of the war in Western Sahara. These 2 projects share an underlying spatio-political substrate: exile, disenfranchisement, militarized borders, and the problematic portrayal in the mainstream media of 2 peoples exiled from their respective homelands. How the complexity of both situations can be conveyed to audiences within the art context has been an underlying topic in my work. Tonight, I wish to focus on how both projects point to the promises and pitfalls contemporary art encounters when taking up its didactic function, particularly when dealing with what can broadly be called postcolonial issues. And finally, what we might learn from the historical avant-gardes of the 1920s when considering this question. In doing so, I want to remind you of some of the questions that motivated this talk series. In what ways can art contribute to spatial justice? How are spaces racialized and segregated artistically? And how do artistic spaces capture, reflect, or comment upon socio-political ideologies? Both projects I will discuss approach these questions in different ways, focusing in particular on the difference between the space of art, both architectural and conceptual, inside and outside the developed world, and how this twinned mental and architectonic space functions in situations of exile and dispossession. An oral history of Picasso and Palestine deals with this question explicitly, examining how the different audiences the project addressed and the different avenues and forms of mediation it chose affected how it was read as a unitary work. Excuse me, I just lost my place. Oh yes, on the other hand, I still grapple with what my Western Sahara research, which deals with the work of an informal collective who describe themselves as a heterogeneous and fluid constellation of researchers and practitioners interested in the relationship between image and conflict in processes of decolonization, is about, and what it means in relation to this question of art and its institutions. I confess that I will probably do little more than share this uncertainty with you. But before I continue, I want to make a brief detour regarding the nature of the Western exhibition space. This space, broadly speaking, follows the logic developed by the museum, which is at once a building, the collection it houses, and the set of procedures developed around conserving and organizing the latter. It also includes that set of strategies for presenting, mediating, and educating its main stakeholder in democratic societies, the public. While they differ in significant ways, exhibition spaces, whether commercial galleries, nonprofit Kunsthalle, or project spaces, inherited this relationship. Notionally public, exhibition spaces serve a particular ideology, exemplified by rational liberal humanism, dedicated to debate within certain limits and freedom of expression with certain constraints. To turn the definition around, one might say society has designated these places as the site where a freedom to question ideology is privileged, inscribed, in fact, as a unique kind of ideology. This sort of space has developed a set of architectural conventions that over time have come to embody this ideological project, the white cube. As Brian O'Doherty writes, the white cube is constructed along laws as rigorous as those for building a medieval church. The outside world must not come in, so windows are usually sealed off. Walls are painted white. The ceiling becomes the source of light. The wooden floor is polished so that you click along clinically, or carpeted so that you pad soundlessly. The art is free, as the saying goes, to take on a life of its own. One might argue that these conditions have now been superseded by the more spectacular form of the contemporary museum come tourist destination. This is one of the galleries of the Broad Museum in Los Angeles, as an instance. But I would argue these older conventions remain a kind of default. The white cube's adoption as a standardized format has meant artists learn to anticipate the specific conditions of visibility it offers, to approach these as an ideal, to think of their work as achieving completion in the white cube's spatial conditions. Although its overarching effect is to render itself placeless and uninflected from particularity as such, this lack of inflection carries with it very special ideological effects. To quote Thomas McElvey, the eternity suggested in our exhibition spaces is ostensibly that of artistic posterity, of undying beauty, of the masterpiece, but in fact it is a specific sensibility with specific limitations and conditionings that is so glorified. By suggesting eternal ratification of a certain sensibility, the white cube suggests the eternal ratification of the claims of the caste or group sharing that sensibility. One might locate the origins of McElvey's claim in the picture galleries of 18th century Europe, where the emergent bourgeois world's social values and political influence first found cultural expression. As this bourgeois world articulated itself, it also developed an internal critique, one form of which was art. Something else came into being here in the exhibition space, a double ordering as in a mirror. The objects on view also called the visitor to order as a spectator, a figure of discernment, confident in his or her right to political power and economic freedom, citizen of the modern democratic nation state. Thus, one can think of exhibition spaces as a stage with artworks and people on view, not bestowing so much as inferring a designation, suggesting the spectator belongs to the bourgeoisie, once defined as a class which does not wish to be named. This is one founding narrative of the contemporary exhibition space, although it possesses a double, a specter who has appeared for brief periods of time. I'm thinking here in particular of the early years of the Soviet Union, when alternative conceptions of art, art's function, and art's audience came into being, and later reappeared during the unrest of the 1960s and early 70s. I will return later to some iterations of this specter and the values and aspirations he or she exemplified. Suffice it to say for now that in both the capitalist democratic world and the socialist world, exhibiting art became equally tied up in the ideological project of state building. This is a crucial aspect of the first project I will talk about, Picasso and Palestine. For those unfamiliar with it, the Picasso and Palestine project involved the transport of a Picasso painting from 1943, the Buste de Femme, from the storeroom of the Van Abbe Museum in Eindhoven to Ramallah, where it was exhibited for 4 weeks in June of 2011 in a specially constructed white cube, installed in the single seminar room of the International Academy of Art, Palestine. The project is a fairly simple proposition, being, as Van Abbe director Charles Esch phrased it at the gala opening, only strictly concerned with the shipment of a small amount of wood, canvas, and paint from one country to another. This bland pronouncement deliberately effaced the central motivation of the project's initiators. All the normative procedures by which museums ordinarily share the accumulated cultural heritage in their possession with each other would be pressed into service to highlight that Palestine is not yet a country. In the making of Picasso and Palestine, wrote Rasha Salti and Khaled Harani in their contribution to A Prior number 22, the means are as interesting as the end. The means are, in fact, an end in themselves. Initially, my main interest in researching the project was both to find out what this meant in practice and to understand what role the international art media played in broadcasting or distorting this fact. For in being reduced to a couple of paragraphs or a minute-long news report, these means would inevitably fail to be explicated. Consequently, the most interesting aspect of the project, how it employed the international protocols of museum loan policy to unmask the onerous administrative relationship between Israel and the occupied West Bank, would remain largely untold. Limits of time or column inches would reduce this complicated topic to a thin factual trickle. Entrenched journalistic habits of depiction would do the rest. The real conditions of occupation the project ostensibly intended to address would be pushed to the margins by that set of stock cliches standing readily at hand to depict life in the West Bank. But this critique of how people living with postcolonial conflict are portrayed in the media, while central to my decision to research the project, perhaps constitutes its least interesting part in the present context. Let me turn to the other aspects of greater relevance to this lecture series topic. The first has to do with the status of art within the context of what David Harvey calls unequal geographical development. The most common local critique of the Picasso project was that at a time of looming economic crisis, why invest so many resources in the symbolic act of importing and exhibiting a single painting? Palestinians answered this question in accordance with who they were speaking on behalf of, members of the cultural elite or everyday people. And I must confess here that a deficit in my project was that the opinions of these everyday people were usually filtered through the scrim of the cultural elite. My second point has to do with the differential between Israel and Palestine with the West regarding art and the spaces of art. The common argument is that Israel is an ally of the West due in great part to shared values, including a shared legacy of artistic creation. I would argue first that this is a massive oversimplification, and secondly, in the present day, not so much a question of a cultural orientation, but of juridical and economic forces. A fancy way of saying that Israelis have far greater access to the masterworks of modernity on account of the ability to travel freely, on account of the network of patrons and donors who bring masterworks to Israel, on account of the strictures Israel places in the way of international trade and relations between the West Bank and the rest of the world, which make importing cultural heritage far more difficult for a Palestinian institution than an Israeli one. An absurd but telling counterpoint to this restriction on movement prevents Palestinians in the West Bank from visiting the Israeli Museum in Jerusalem with its Picasso collection and other masterworks, even if they were disposed to visit. Several interviews in Chapter 7 of my graphic novel underline this nexus between idea and access and how it relates to Palestinians' relationship to modernity. One was with project manager Fatima Abdul Karim, who met me after going on a tour of the Jewish Museum in Berlin, a tour which only confirmed her belief that Palestinians remain in a position of absolute exteriority to modernity. And the thing is, she says, my only relationship with that museum is that I'm Palestinian. I was nowhere inside. This is also a recurrent theme in Palestine's encounter with modernity. And it is not just that we were, in a sense, victims of modernity. We were also victims of both our own self-portrayal and our own portrayal by the West, in Orientalism, in neo-capitalism. A second view, which one might call the view from Jerusalem, takes a more nuanced view. Jack Persekian, director of Al Mamel Gallery in East Jerusalem, said the following on this topic. The encounter with modernity occurred a long time ago, and it happened in different ways. On the one hand, with regard to Palestinian art, some of the artists, we're talking about the older generation now, went abroad and studied and learned about the whole modernist period of art in Europe and the world, and they encountered Picassos and Matisses and everything. And they've studied in academies in different places, either in Europe or the Arab world. And on the other side of this equation, I dare say after '67, Palestine was also somehow aggressively invaded by Israelis, who brought with them a certain exposure to European culture and modernity. Some of the very important artists, living artists, like Slimane Mansour, studied at Bezalel Academy in West Jerusalem. So when Israel came it opened those doors up, and it allowed for the possibility of this exposure to modernity. Suddenly you had access to the museums in Jerusalem and elsewhere, because the whole country was open and you could go freely anywhere. Before '93, the people of Ramallah and Hebron and Gaza could have easily visited the Israel Museum. Everybody traded and worked in Israel and did all sorts of things. Why not go to the museum? They have a pretty good collection there. The last perspective would render a geographical and class analysis to this topic, and this came from Yazid Anani, an architect, academic, and curator and son of well-known painter Nabil Anani, who said, "Maybe Jack was really going with his family. Then you have to really look at the social classes at that time. My father is coming from a village, and he's an artist. I don't think he was going to museums. So what kind of art, what kind of social class are you talking about at that time? This is one thing. The question of status in the art scene is another." Vera Tamari, and this is a well-known artist and cultural figure in Ramallah. She comes from a rich family with a family status and so on. It's part of the ritual of that social class to go to museums, so she was exposed. These three perspectives on the relationship between Palestinians and modernity accord neatly with an idea Judith Butler addresses in her portion of the book, Contingency, Hegemony, Universality. Conceptually, both museum and masterwork rest on a foundational claim identified with an a priori universal cultural norm. The determinant of such a claim by those not authorized in advance to make it requires an active translation to avoid appearing under the signs of a colonial expansionist logic. However, any universal claim is never accomplished outside of being staged within a particular context, making it impossible to separate its formal from its cultural features. So, and I would just mention that one of the jokes that this is a slide from the opening of the Picasso and Palestine exhibition, and one of the jokes was, because this is a very, this folkloric, bands that they had and dancers with burning swords. This is something that you would find at a village wedding. And so the joke was that Khaled Harani was marrying Charles Esch, the director of the Academy, the director of the Van Abbey Museum. Picasso and Palestine's deployment of the artist Picasso's iconicity and the white cube does not evade such a move's historical baggage, but rather enters into a situation of double infection, contaminated both by the particular context from which it emerged and in which it travels. The appropriation of the term universal by those excluded from its purview, as Butler goes on to note, also commonly produces a performative contradiction, which is not self-canceling, but exposes the spectral doubling of the concept itself. One can cite the project's deployment of a particular modernist artifact within its ersatz white cube as a carrier for this doubling, with its particular and universal aspects oscillating uneasily between the partiality of the local and the empty and ineradicable place of universality itself. Aspiring states aspire to universal value-producing activities such as art exhibitions, that prima facie form of 20th century soft power, although in this case the presence of arms guards was somewhat running counter to that appearance of soft power. And indeed, in a film conversation with Khaled Harani and Van Abbey curator Remco de Blage, Slavoj Žižek, in typically histrionic fashion avowed that it's the duty of every nation state to show works of universal art. It may be pure coincidence, but in the years since the project was held, it is noteworthy how prominent museum projects have become in the West Bank. Perhaps because, as a form of soft power, founding museums is one of the few avenues for state building remaining to the PA. The Picasso and Palestine project was a singularly ambitious work and singularly open to many different sorts of readings. Social and historical contingency and entrenched forms of power suggest the project's parameters, as did openness to different significations as it surfed the wave of possibility or of foreclosure. An example of the former, the Palestinian Authority lending much needed support, aware of the likely positive PR the project might generate. An example of the latter, that central unachievable goal of the project, to have the bill of lading state that the painting's destination was Palestine rather than Israel. This openness also speaks to rather depressing limits of possibility in the current post-Oslo context, which one might compare to other more revolutionary artistic modalities, such as the long history of poster making and other projects. This is Bride of the Nation by Slimane Mansour, which was made in 1976, and the legend about it was that it was printed as an edition of about 1,000 posters, most of which were immediately seized, but by Israeli soldiers, but some of which circulated then surreptitiously afterwards. So this has become, from this period of the 70s occupation, one of the most famous works of Palestinian art. But anyway, the long history of poster making and other projects, where art still will, while perhaps still remaining indebted to modernist tropes, was enlisted in the project of Palestinian liberation through raising national consciousness among the fellahin rather than catering to Palestine's urban cultural elites. Revolutionary becoming, one might say, conceives of institutional space differently than established nation states. In discussing Picasso and Palestine with me, Yazid Anani told me how his father and other Palestinian artists of the 1970s, including Mansour, quote, managed to use art at that moment as part of the historical context, the political context, by making exhibitions informally in Palestine under the occupation without the knowledge of the Israeli soldiers. They were traveling by car, so they made paintings small enough to fit inside a car. They never really worked in huge sizes because it was out of the question, because they wouldn't fit inside the car. They borrowed money from their parents and they drove from village to village to draw, to talk to people, and to exhibit. And at that time, there was no knowledge of museums, but there was a motive. There was a function for art at that moment. I mean, I was with them, going with them from village to village. While the white cube served to mark the absence of the state and the museum in the West Bank, the second example I want to speak about presents another way in which artists have worked with the notion of legacy and of site. In this case, the space of art, the white cube, has been evacuated in favor of the non-site, with the eschewal in this project of sanctioned spaces of artistic exhibition being meant to refer to the difficult predicament of the Western Saharans, the Sahrawi, who live as exiles in refugee camps located deep in the inhospitable Algerian Sahara, or under onerous Moroccan rule in the occupied territory itself. The strategies this project has pursued were also deployed to address or mirror the relative obscurity of the conflict on the world stage. Indeed, the conflict in Western Sahara is so obscure that when speaking of my work publicly, I generally feel the need to provide historical background. It began 44 years ago, after Morocco invaded this former Spanish colony in 1976, on the eve of Spain's ceding colonial rule, precipitating the exodus of approximately 70% of the Sahrawi population to refugee camps in southwest Algeria. 15 years of war followed, fought between Moroccan and Sahrawi forces. The UN successfully negotiated a ceasefire in 1991, conditional on an adjudication of territorial status by popular referendum, a vote that has yet to take place. To this day, the Sahara Arab Democratic Republic and its political wing, the Polisario Front, continue to demand self-determination while governing as a state in exile. The Moroccans rule the territory, albeit without international legitimacy, and the Sahrawi live in the occupied territory, Sahrawi living in the occupied territory continue to contest Moroccan rule at great risk to health and liberty. The Western Sahara conflict led to the displacement not only of people, but of personal property, including a singular collection of photographs estimated at some 70,000 images. which, although rarely showing war itself, were created by war. It consists of personal photographs brought to the field of battle by Moroccan soldiers as mementos and subsequently retrieved by Sahrawi soldiers from captured or killed Moroccans. Instead of discarding these personal effects, the photographs were preserved. The collection slowly growing in the desert, stored at the War Museum, set up by the Polisario to document its struggle against Morocco. By doing so, the Sahrawi inadvertently preserved a unique photographic record of post-colonial Moroccan society, an iconographic cross-section of the proletariat, peasantry, and lower middle class, dating from the decades after independence. Between 1998 and 2016, a small selection of these photographs has been used by the aforementioned informal collective, a group made up of European and Sahrawi artists, activists, in a dialogical practice called Encounters. This practice is inspired foremost by the Sahrawis' gesture in preserving the personal photographs belonging to their enemy. Collective member Patrizio Esposito claims the Sahrawis' collecting abilities had at some point ceased being a means of gathering intelligence, becoming instead a sort of involuntary collecting, whereby the Polisario made themselves the transitory guardians of the pictures. As their familiarity with Moroccan soldiers grew, it became clear to the Sahrawi that these were poverty-stricken people, and they began to differentiate between the common soldiers, whom they used to call our cousins, and their real enemy, the Moroccan king. Thus, Encounters show these photographs as a means of discussing the predicament of the Sahrawi without negating the historical trauma of impoverished Moroccan conscripts, and, as mentioned earlier, to stage the absence of the Western Sahara conflict on the world stage. Encounters function like this. Organizers and participants are seated in a circle at the chosen meeting site, after which a group member begins by presenting an account of the conflict and the collective's reflections on its invisibility. This introduction can be lengthy, and a good deal of time elapses before participants look at the book. And I'm sorry, you will not see any of the photographs contained in this book because I've made a promise not to show any of these images outside of the context of encounters that I might participate in. Anyway, so the introduction can be lengthy, and a good deal of time usually elapses before the participants look at the book, in which the photographs have been reproduced, made after it became clear the photographs were too fragile to endure further handling. It's a dilatory strategy designed to encounter an ingrained tendency in the West to consume images, to relate to something visual. The collective, as one of its members, the artist Yasmin Eid-Sabag has noted, refrained from giving people images immediately to drink or to swallow, really trying to put them in another type of attention and disposition of listening and talking. In fact, it is rare that an explicit offer is made to take the book in hand, and that taking the book in hand, opening it, and examining its contents is a private, individual act, and that taking the book in hand, opening it, and examining its contents is a private individual act, and this is an important aspect of the work Encounters propose to do. Encounters construct a specific sort of gaze, stressing the situated corporeality of vision, a horizontal gaze, head bowed, book held in the viewer's lap, as opposed to the predominating within exhibition spaces, where framed images are hung up on a wall for the disembodied eye of the spectator to consume. Encounters set up another sort of place for a look to take place, setting a look in place, creating a relationship between the pictures and the viewer where war becomes present, not abstract and far away. Early on in Driss Ben Hamed Shahadi's novel, A Life Full of Holes, the narrator Ahmed describes a journey with his mother back to her home city, interrupted when they are detained by soldiers. Hearing explosions far away, young Ahmed asks his mother what the noise is. She tells him it is the war. Which war is not specified. And I should mention this is a Moroccan novel, lest there's any confusion. But when she said war, Ahmed tells the reader, I thought it was nothing. It was like a game, or the wind. What is war? I thought. Not something in the world, not something that is a part of life. I think at its essence, encounters are about bringing war back into life, so that its consequences are no longer felt as abstract and distant. But there is something else in the photographs that motivated the group and informed their decision to hold encounters, not in sanctioned art spaces, but in in-between spaces, private homes, guest houses, libraries, construction sites, or derelict buildings. It has something to do with the sensation Esposito encountered when he first saw the photographs stored at the Sahrawi War Museum, a sensation that also speaks to the universality Judith Butler addresses. Esposito said in one of our first interviews, it was May 17th, 1991. On January 17th of the same year, the first military aggression in Iraq began. In the news, the broadcasts from the war in Iraq, the faces and bodies of the victims, those killed, were absent. When I opened for the first time the door of the storehouse in the museum complex, it was as if the faces and the bodies that had been erased the previous January had emerged there. It was as if opening the box and finding these faces that came from the war created in me a kind of stupor or dream. It was as if these faces in that box had a relationship with something universal. The faces in the box were universal. All the conflicts in the world were in that box, not only the Western Sahara conflict. All the conflicts were there. And this realization opened my mind about the conflict, about the information, about the imperial information. That is to say, the hegemony exercised by the media, which, when speaking about the death of innocents in war, now uses a technical term, collateral damage. I prefer la morte civili. The problem of the here and elsewhere of political art, when it tries to reflect on the consequences of colonial history in our supposedly post-colonial time, has precisely to do with the codes of comportment that go along with the disembodied spectator's eye. The white cube may be an adequate place for understanding processes, but perhaps the habitus of spectatorship gets in the way of feeling. Looking back from this far side of the halfway line of this talk, it occurs to me to address the red thread linking the one project to the other. Certainly, a thematic connection is the question of how each uses artistic means to address questions of exile and dispossession and dreams of statehood. A second is their respective staging of the gaze. Picasso as political spectacle, encounters as a question of ethics undertaken on a discrete human scale. Another consideration is their respective engagement with the system of art, its conventional modes of exhibition and dissemination. Each project responds to the art system's established tropes of exhibition and dissemination, either by subverting them or refusing them. In doing so, each frames or stages how the inside of invested stakeholders relates to the outside, to those not directly affected by the given political situation, and calling on those outside to think through what solidarity might mean to them. Blankly parodic, Picasso and Palestine was, from its inception, conceived as a project addressed to both local and international audiences, with photographs of the painting in its ersatz white cube disseminated to illustrate any number of positions on Palestinian statehood. On the other hand, the informal collective's nearly total refusal of both exhibition space and the valorization that comes with it, and their reluctance to publicize their work or name themselves, represents a completely opposed position, an attempt to treat the photographic collection they work with in a manner concordant with the context out of which these photographs emerged. Someone else's property, orphaned by war. This reality, they thought, placed an absolute bar on any form of dissemination, then person-to-person transfer. For to do otherwise would dishonor those depicted. Something of this fealty is caught in what the philosophers Riccardo Panettone and Gianluca Sola have written about the project. Images have something irrecoverable about them. In them, the loss of bodies is registered, which is also why images fall into decay. And yet we usually entrust to images the task of keeping something which would otherwise be lost, be it a memory, an impression, or vague resemblance. We wish we could appropriate images in order to appropriate the faces, the invisible aspects of the bodies, and the fact that we miss them. Beyond such decay, images prove to be other than the instruments of representation or the testimonial documentation we would like them to be. An image is something completely in itself, a fragment on which the irrecoverable of the world is inscribed. In my abstract for this talk, I suggested that the historical avant-gardes had a lesson to impart when considering contemporary art's didactic function, particularly with regards to postcoloniality. Thinking about this, I found myself again consulting Walter Benjamin's The Author as Producer. His main argument was to distinguish between artists of a merely correct political tendency and those pursuing an authentically revolutionary art. Rather than what a work's position was vis-a-vis the production relations of its time, Benjamin wished to ask what a work's position was within them. A correct tendency was not enough. That was to assume a place beside the proletariat. And what kind of place is that, Benjamin asks? That of a benefactor, of an ideological patron, an impossible place. The place of the intellectual in the class struggle can be determined, or better still chosen, he claims, on the basis of his position within the production processes. For to supply a production apparatus without trying, within the limits of the possible, to change it is a highly disputable activity, even when the material supplied appears to be of a revolutionary nature. Since we are confronted with the fact that the bourgeois apparatus of production and publication is capable of assimilating, indeed even of propagating, an astonishing amount of revolutionary themes without ever seriously putting into question its own continued existence or that of the class which owns it. Benjamin's own answer, addressing the historical conditions of his time, was to privilege productivism, the effort to extend constructivist formal experiments, as with the Bauhaus here in Germany, into actual industrial production, over prolet cult, the system of cultural clubs for the proletarian, supported by the Soviet state as a precondition to developing an authentically proletarian culture. He also claimed intellectual production could not become politically useful until the separate spheres of competence to which, according to the bourgeois view, the process of intellectual production owes its order have been surmounted. More precisely, the barriers of competence must be broken down by each of the productive forces that they were created to separate, acting in concert. One concrete example for eliding these separate spheres of competence was for writers to provide captions for modish photographs that would confer upon them a revolutionary use value. Or better yet, writers should start taking photographs themselves. Another was the situation of Soviet newspapers, where, as Benjamin said, the reader is always prepared to become a writer, in the sense of being one who describes or prescribes, with authority to write, no longer found in a specialist training, but in a polytechnical one. The place where the word is most debased that is to say, the newspaper, then becomes the very place where a rescue operation can be mounted. Rather than substituting postcolonial struggle for class struggle, I suggest there is today a pressing need to add the one to the other, to make both artists and audiences not patrons of postcolonial or class struggle, or the struggle against patriarchy, but partisans of them all. This may appear like an impossible demand, and indeed, Benjamin's proviso to act within the limits of the possible suggests he was well aware of the difficulty. My own thoughts on the matter are twofold and fall far short of suggesting how the functional transformation of patronage into partisanship might be accomplished. One idea is to reevaluate the local instead of compulsively framing far-flung artistic activities within Western-oriented paradigms, to privilege specific local audiences over the international art cognoscenti, and suggest that there may be a variety of ways art might function, not all of which should necessarily be integrated into a worldwide art system of creation, exhibition, and publicizing. This would be to privilege the question, for whom is a work made, for which audience or constituency, instead of assuming a notional I who has ready access to its codes, its contextual nuances, its specific and perhaps untranslatable particularities. To claim that some knowledge is not universally available or transmissible, a claim that goes radically against the ready availability of consumer goods and home-delivered sushi that is the basis for our contemporary on-demand economy, and a habit of mind that bleeds over perhaps into contemporary culture, is being asked today by citizens of the First Nations who increasingly question the supposed objectivity of knowledge, developing practices of rehoming and a politics of refusal that, in the words of Sebastian Delaine, resist institutional insatiability, the bottomless desire to know, to place, document, catalog, recontextualize, objectify, and consume knowledge for the sake of feeding its, or our own, hunger pangs. Perhaps not all art is or should be universally available. Perhaps not all art is intended to heal the narcissistic wound of the Western self. So this first form of prospective partisanship would involve a form of decoupling or divestment. A second would be to discover again that privileging the local has happened before, that in the post-war era, there were already many instances across the emergent post-colonial world where artists and creators did not turn their backs on Western influence in order to return to traditional forms of cultural expression, but sought to put Western innovation in the service of new forms of national expression, and that these efforts were for local consumption rather than export. Sometimes these past efforts were sanctioned by the state. More frequently, the state found these efforts to be uncomfortably progressive and put a stop to them. There's a whole lineage of syncretized, creolized cultural forms waiting to be rediscovered and put in the service of a future possibility. That both the Picasso and Palestine project or the informal collectives encounters open up these questions of locality, of insides and outsides, is why I find them interesting, and why I also find that they don't rest comfortably in either place. That is both their strength and their weakness. Thank you.